Our speaker this morning is Roxanne Spillett. In her 16-year tenure as president and CEO of Boys and Girls Clubs of America, she has led the most successful transformation of what is today one of the top 10 nonprofit organizations in America. The Boys and Girls Club movement is made up of more than 4,000 club affiliates in the United States and on U.S. military bases across the world. With a combined staff of 50,000 full-time and part-time employees and $1.5 billion in revenues, the movement serves some 4 million boys and girls. Spillett's 1996 appointment to the presidency marked a new era. She led BGCA through a decade of major expansion, implementing a growth strategy that more than doubled the size and scope of the movement and tripled its revenues. She also strategically led the drive to increase services for children in non-traditional environments, including public housing, Native American lands, and one noteworthy achievement is a partnership with the Department of Defense, which has chartered Boys and Girls Clubs on more than 400 U.S. military bases worldwide. Under her leadership, BGCA created generation-changing initiatives in education, technology, financial literacy, health and fitness, and civic engagement. She also led the development and launch of a far-reaching plan that commits BGCA to ensure lasting impact in the lives of young people. Spillett earned her bachelor's degree in education from the State University of New York, did graduate work in guidance and counseling at St. Lawrence University. She also studied public health administration at Hunter College in New York. In recent years, she has received 5 honorary doctoral degrees, including one in law from the University of Notre Dame. Today, she teaches graduate students in the Master of Nonprofit Administration program in the Mendoza College of Business. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Roxanne Spillett.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see all of you here, and I'm totally excited to be here for a lot of reasons. One is this university, which I have come to know and love, and I can't tell you how proud I am to be part of the university and how special I feel that I have the opportunity through the M&A program to give back a lot of what I've learned in my career. And so for me, I think of my life, my career in thirds. The first third of my life is about learning and growing. The second third is learning, growing, and leading. And the last part of my chapter, the last chapter, is learning, growing, leading, and giving back. So I feel through my work with the M&A program, which is tops in the country, that I have an opportunity to give back, and I find the students are awesome, and I just love it. So for me, it's a thrill to be here and to share some history and some insights into the nonprofit sector today. And I also want to give a special thanks to Tom Harvey, who leads the M&A program, the Master of Nonprofit Administration program, and he and I go back many years, and I'm very proud to work side by side with Tom, who is a formidable leader among nonprofit leaders. So Tom, thank you for your friendship, for your leadership. Okay, let me get started. This idea of 10 years hence, I want to talk a little bit about that because I struggled at first with what that means and how I would approach it. And 10 years hence, I thought, would typically mean that I would stand before you and I would talk about what the nonprofit sector would be like 10 years from now. What are the trends? What are the challenges? Well, I started down that path, and it kind of didn't feel natural to me. And because I'm obsessed with not just the future of nonprofits, but the future of America. And so for me, the future of nonprofits has to play a role in assuring that the future of America is bright. And so that's really how I approach this. And I want to lay out a story for you about some facts, alarming ones, I might add, and the fact that we're at a crossroads in America, and we have 2 paths. We have a bright path, and we have a not-so-bright path. And the difference between the two is not only about how the nonprofit community, all 1.6 million nonprofits, operate, but it's also about how we operate together with the public sector, the private sector, to make this country what it could be, what it should be, and hopefully what it will be. So just bear with me and as I paint a picture for you. Now, I know all of you, like me, have hopes of great magnitude for this country, for the future of America. And I would tell you this, that achieving these hopes that we all share for the future of America will take more than doing the ordinary things we must, but rather it will take us all doing the extraordinary things that we can and ought to do. Now, in just 10 years, and I'd like you to visualize this, those 10-year-olds, those 12-year-olds out there, the teenagers, the tweens, call them what you may, they're 10 and 12 years old. They are going to be the workforce of tomorrow. Those 10 and 12, just 10 years from now, they're going to be our future workforce. We would expect them to be leaders of America's institutions, of America's great institutions. We would expect those 10 or 12-year-old boys and girls today to be in the forefront of innovation, of technology, of progress. Those young people are the future of America. But what kind of future is that going to be? So, if you think about America today, you think about kids today, you think of those 10-year-olds, those 12-year-olds, those 14, 15-year-olds, here's what we see. Only 7 out of 10 students, high school students, I should say 7 out of 10 students are going to graduate from high school. And if they happen to be minority, which will soon become the majority, only 5 out of 10 are going to graduate from high school. 5 out of 10, that's 1 out of 2. High school students in America are going to drop out of school. Think about that. Minorities soon becoming the majority, 1 out of 2 dropping out of school. Now, if you think about that, the total that we're talking about is every year, 1.2 million students drop out of school. 1.2. That's 6,400 students drop out every day. 6,400 students drop out every day at a cost, by the way, of $250 billion over the course of their lifetime. And you know, I think in this country we have the idea that it's just seniors that drop out of high school. Well, that's not true. 63% of those 1.2 million young people that are dropping out of high school, 63% are gone before they finish the 10th grade. Before they finish the 10th grade. And if they happen to get a diploma, that diploma isn't as valuable as it once was, because today, America, among 35 developed nations, ranks 14th in reading, 17th in science, and 25th in math. Yet education is the heart of democracy. It is the foundation of this country, of freedom and equality, and what makes America great. Not a great picture. Now there's more. 1 out of 3 children, mostly minorities and urban young people, are significantly overweight or obese, while 2 million kids go to bed hungry every night. More than 2 million kids are arrested every year, while instead they could be serving their communities and their country. And so 10 years hence, and this is my point, 10 years hence can be a good path or a not so good path. But the consequences of not addressing what I just described, are staggering. Our future workforce is at risk, number one. Our global competitiveness is at risk, number two. Our national security is at risk, number three. And probably, for the first time in the history of our country, for the first time, our future economic security is going to depend on how well poor children do. Okay? So we have a scenario for 10 years hence if we don't intervene in a meaningful and substantial way. The consequences are staggering. So all of this, I hate to say this, I don't mean to depress anybody here, but all of this is exacerbated by the fiscal limitations that our government will have. It's all exacerbated by the limited resources, public and private sector, that will be available for nonprofits in America. So we will see not a diminishing problem, but an escalating problem, making it more important for nonprofits to put these issues on the top of their agenda and address them with everything they've got. So now is not the time. Now, I would emphasize that now is not the time to be complacent. Now is the time to be courageous. It's our time to serve those who need us most, to reach and serve those who need us most, and to do so with ever-increasing levels of impact and clear result. And so let me share with you our journey, and I think there's a lot of lessons that we learned in the Boys and Girls Club journey over the last several years, many years. And I want to share them with you because I think 10 years hence, when we think about a brighter picture, some of these lessons, I believe, will be very important, not just for the nonprofit sector, but for the private sector and for the public sector as well. So let me begin by talking about this concept of outreach to needy. And there is a gentleman, a very scholarly, noted researcher in the nonprofit world. His name is Lester Solomon, and he's from Johns Hopkins University. And he just published the second edition of Nonprofit America that describes in great detail and in great length the perils and the possibilities of the nonprofit sector. He describes it in great length. And one of the things he says, and it's the first line of his book, he says, a struggle is underway right now for the soul of the nonprofit sector. That's a pretty profound statement. Well, what did he mean by that? He had a lot of thoughts about that, but one thought that is of great concern to me, given what I've just laid out for you, is the fact that the nonprofit sector, according to Lester Solomon, has a dilemma between what he calls the distinctive imperative and the survival imperative. The distinctive imperative is simply that nonprofits historically and in their hearts are always there for the people who need us most, for the poor, for the needy, for the disadvantaged. The nonprofits are always there. That's been our history. That's our roots. The survival imperative is quite different. Nonprofits experiencing diminishing resources are now going to where the paying customers are, potentially leaving behind those who need us most. And so outreach to the poor, outreach to disadvantaged, outreach to those who need us most, Lester Solomon is at risk. And in fact, he says a survival imperative has the edge. We can't let that happen. Not when we see the consequences of the problems of this young generation, because they are a mirror image of our future. And so I want to talk a little bit about our outreach efforts, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned. Hey, how many of you know about Boys and Girls Clubs? I should ask this. Do we have any former members of the Boys and Girls Club? Wow, okay, good. Typically, Most people know about the Boys and Girls Club, and I'm glad about that because our brand has grown dramatically. But in an audience like this, probably very few have actually come up through the Boys and Girls Club, and I'm glad to see some hands raised here. But the point here is that Boys and Girls Clubs are facility-based. They have paid professional staff. Their mission is to help those young people who need us most and to assure that their future is productive, that they are responsible and caring citizens. And we've been around for 150 plus years and serving kids 6 to 18 years old. So several years ago, about more than a decade ago, we had a big planning process. And the planning process, there was one overwhelming fact, and this was in the 90s, that the world had changed for kids because mothers were working, there were more single parents than ever, and millions and millions and millions of kids in this country were coming home to an empty home, or they were on the dangerous streets. They were unsupervised, they were unproductive, they were unsafe, and they needed a safe place, they needed caring adults, they needed activities that would not only interest them, but engage them and help them develop. And so out of that planning meeting came, as Jim Collins would say, a big, hairy, audacious goal. That goal for us was to double the size of the Boys and Girls Club movement, double the number of clubs in the Boys and Girls Club movement with the intent of reaching those who need us most. And so when we thought about that, I would say with a lot of anxiety, when our chairman announced to our entire delegation, our board chairman, that this is the future direction of the Boys and Girls Club movement. And one of the first places we began to look strategically at was public housing. You know, there's a big concentration of kids in public housing, kids who need us most. And so we decided we'd do a little experiment, and we opened 5 clubs in public housing. We matched them with 5 like clubs. We engaged Columbia University to do an evaluation of the results. Did it make a difference? We didn't know. Would it make a difference? And what Columbia University, as independent evaluators, found was truly significant. Crime went down in the public housing developments with clubs compared to those that did not have a club. Drug use went down, vandalism went down, and parental involvement in their children's activities went up. And so we had an evaluation that said, wow, we could really make a difference there. And we took that evaluation to Congress, and there were a lot of bipartisan support for investing in Boys and Girls Clubs to take that concept to scale. And so we went about opening up more and more clubs in public housing. And it was great because we didn't have to invest the capital. And the buildings were provided by public housing. They provided the buildings and the maintenance. We provided the people and the programs so that it became easy for us to operate without a lot of overhead, and we could put more money behind mission. And so we went about our work in public housing, and with real intentionality and great enthusiasm. You know, Jack Kemp, who was a Secretary of HUD at the time, he used to say to everybody, those people at Boys and Girls Clubs are nuts, they're crazy. Everybody's dying to get out of public housing, and they're dying to get in, and we did. And today we have over 400 clubs in public housing. And we also decided that probably the one place where children are really the most forgotten are in Native American, Native Alaskan lands. And just so happens that President Clinton, in his second term, toured the 10 poorest places in America. The poorest place was the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And he stood there and made a statement. He simply said that America has to do better than this. He looked at the poverty, the alcoholism, the suicide, the devastation. Despair was everywhere, but hope was hard to find. He said, we can do better than this for our children. And following that visit, we got a call very quickly from the White House asking us to establish a Boys and Girls Club on the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is about the size of the state of Connecticut. And the poverty there is unbelievable. And so we did, and the White House pledged to help us, and they did. And we got a beautiful Boys and Girls Club started there. And then we went and started meeting with other tribal leaders and spreading the idea. And we even had the people from Pine Ridge, the Native Americans from Pine Ridge, reaching out to other Native American communities about this idea of a Boys and Girls Club. And today we have over 200 clubs on Native American lands serving those who need us most. One other example I would like to talk about is sometimes those who need us most aren't as obvious as it is on Native American lands or on public housing developments. So when Desert Storm broke out, what happened there is those that were deployed were reserve, National Guard, and active duty living off base. They didn't have the support system that a base provides for families. And suddenly, the father, in most cases, sometimes the mother, were called for duty. Everything changed for that family. The mother now was head of household. The young boy is now the man of the house. The stress on the family that once was a whole unit is now not any longer. And there have been many studies about the stress levels and the anxiety levels of children and families where there have been deployments. On base, that's true too, because if kids live on base, they're going to move 6 or 8 times in the course of their school career. And so we decided that we needed to be there. We didn't know a whole lot about the military, but we needed to be there for the children of the military. We needed to support the families who now needed that extra assist with their children. And so we went to the Department of Defense, I might add, with very little knowledge about the military, which is an interesting, complex, and fascinating institution. We knew little about the culture. We knew little about how things work. We just went there with a little knowledge and a lot of heart. And we sat down and we said, listen, we're an American institution. You know, we feel that if there's a role for us to play, it's our responsibility to do that. And we talked a lot about how we could support military families. And as a result of that conversation, we really provided pretty intense services to over 20,000 children of military personnel who were deployed across this country. And our relationship with the military grew, and in fact, they invited us to be present on base, and we did. And today we have 450 clubs on military bases. Last example, and a short one, but a powerful one, about reaching those who need us most. We have 1,000 clubs right in schools. You know that Willie Sutton expression, you know, when you rob banks, go where the money is? Well, if you want to reach kids, you go where the kids are. They're in school. And so we went to school after school after school, and we started programs in school. And then we had another idea that I think has powerful potential for the future. And that is, we began meeting with superintendents at a local level, and particularly the superintendents who were going to go about the process of constructing a new school. And we said to them, listen, let's play around with an idea here. We've been building schools as they are for 100 years. But everything in a child's life has changed. So let's start with a tabula rasa, a blank piece of paper, and see what that school of today would look like. And so in case after case, we looked at this idea, although it manifested itself differently, of constructing a Boys and Girls Club and a school under one roof. Now, the club would be open at 6:30 or 7 in the morning when a single parent typically has to drop a young child off at school, and they wait outside until the school is open. But now they go into the Boys and Girls Club, they have breakfast, they get help with their homework, and they're ready to start their day right. After school, instead of getting out there on the streets before their parents are home, they simply go back to the Boys and Girls Club under that same roof. And so from 7 in the morning till 7 at night, kids have a safe place to go. People who care and people who will not let them fail. Now, that idea has merit in America, I believe, because where else would kids be at 7 o'clock in the morning when their parents have to travel to work? And where else would they be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when their parents are still at work? And so here are some thoughts that have evolved from our experience about how to reach and serve kids who need us most and do it in a cost-effective way without investing millions and millions and millions of dollars in capital construction, but being there to support not just kids, but their families. So I'm proud to say that we achieved that goal. And let me just give you a little chronology here. We had 1,800 clubs. We were going to double that to 3,600. Although there are people who like to round things off. Some rounded it down to 3,500. Others rounded it up to 4,000. And I will say this, that we quickly reached our 2,000th club, and it was the Andre Agassi Boys and Girls Club in Las Vegas, Nevada. Now, Colin Powell was on our board at the time, and he was there for the dedication of this 2,000th club. And he stood there in the gym with, you know, when Colin Powell comes, everybody turns out. I mean, there were crowds outside the building. Inside was full. And he got to the podium, and he did something that actually worried me a little bit until I figured out what he was doing. He stood at that podium, it seemed like endlessly, and all he did was look around the room. All he did was look around the room, just like this. He would look around the room. And finally, he spoke. And what he said was simple but profound. He said, "You see all these bricks? You see all this lighting, all this wiring, all this roofing, all this insulation? You see all this? It takes about this much stuff to build a jail. It takes about this much stuff to build a jail." And then he said, "It's time to stop building jails and start building our children in places like this." His point was pretty profound. If that club wasn't there, those kids would be on the street. And so 2000, Club 2000, the Andre Agassi Boys and Girls Club in Las Vegas. Club 3000 in Camden, New Jersey. And for those of you who know Camden, you know it is one of the most distressed communities and cities in America. Club 4000 was in Houston, Texas, started with the National Football League. But one thing Colin Powell did at that Andre Agassi opening, which scared me a little bit, after he discussed how we have to build more clubs, he looked at me and the chairman of the board, and he said publicly, "When can I expect Club 3000? And so, I'm glad to say the pressure was within anyway, but when General Powell asks you that, you got to have an answer. And so we said, "Yes, sir." And fortunately, we reached the 3,000th club, on to the 4,000th club, and then everything changed. We met our goals. We were happy. We created a footprint unlike any other nonprofit. We're in urban and rural communities, Native American, Native Alaskan lands, military bases here in the US and across the world, and public housing and public schools. We had reached a footprint. We had the ability and the responsibility to use that footprint to bring about some real positive change in America. And so here we are today, 4,000 clubs, 50,000 employees. Is that right, Jim? 50,000 employees, 200,000 volunteers, $1.5 billion in revenues, and we still have responsibility big time, because now with a footprint that big and the challenges for kids so great, we have a responsibility to be as deep in our impact as we are broad in our reach. And so we use our size and scope and say we've got to be focused now on impact. And we have a vision, a new vision. It's not to grow the movement as we did before, but it is to assure that every child who walks through our doors progresses successfully from one grade to the next on time and graduates from high school with a plan for their future, demonstrating a healthy lifestyle and a commitment to service and civic engagement. So that's what we're all about now, using our size and scale and going deep in impact so that we can play a role addressing some of the big impact issues in America today. And we had a lot of lessons to learn here, because we have all these stories about kids who come through Boys and Girls Clubs. You know, Denzel Washington is our spokesperson. You know, he will say, you know, the Boys and Girls Club not only helped me become what I am, the Boys and Girls Club helped me become who I am. Who I am, that's pretty important. The stories about how we save and change lives are everywhere. They make you cry. They inspire you to do great things. But what we understood is that now going deep in impact and creating greater social impact required us to do things differently. And so we're part two for us, not that we didn't have impact before, but part two for us now was really going deep in this idea of social impact. I want to come back to Denzel Washington for a minute just to illustrate a point. So he comes from Mount Vernon, New York, and he went to the boys, at the time, the Boys Club in Mount Vernon, New York. And he always tells the story that he had this staff person in the Mount Vernon Club who always told him, Denzel, you can be anything you want to be. Anything you want to be, you can be. And he talks about going into the gym. And there was a tradition in that club that every single club member that went on to college, their first break in their freshman year when they came home, they would hang their banner in the gym. So if you looked around the gym, there were banners everywhere. Great. So Denzel tells a story that he never even engaged in a discussion about college, never thought about it, until the day when a staff person took him in the gym and said, you see all these banners around this gym? One day you have to come back and hang your banner there too. And so that inspired him. It inspired him to go on to college, to graduate, and to come back and hang his banner. And you know, the rest is history. Went on not to do just great things in an acting career, but to be a humanitarian and to come back to the Boys and Girls Club, not just as a board member, but as a national spokesperson. And so we tell stories about our alumni all the time. Jennifer Lopez, she learned to sing and dance in the Bronx at the Kips Bay Boys and Girls Club. That's where she learned to sing and dance. I knew her when she was 12 years old. 12 years old, and 25 years old, and 35 years old don't seem as far apart to me anymore. So let me kind of describe for you where I think that the Boys and Girls Club needs to go and where I think the sector needs to go in terms of achieving true social impact. What we really understood is that good intentions and anecdotal stories were not enough. Good intentions and anecdotal stories were not enough to bring about the kind of change that we need to bring about for kids in America, to put them on the path to success. We determined that our ability to succeed in social impact would be determined by our commitment to leading and managing our organizations in the Boys and Girls Club movement to achieve outcomes. And it was clear that if we were going to be successful in our powerful and purposeful vision, we needed to address impact with a lot of intentionality. And that we needed to go from an organization and a movement that was outcome intended to outcome driven. And what do I mean by outcome driven? It means leading, it means managing, it means planning in order to achieve specific outcomes. So we had to shift our thinking, and I'm sure you'll understand what I mean, from meeting needs to getting a result, from counting participants to assessing measurable impact. We had to go from doing the same thing over and over again to using data to help us course correct and make sure we got the impact we were looking for. And so that required a fundamental change in the way we think, in the way we plan, in the way we lead. And it's a very simple process. The first thing we have to do is ask ourselves, where are we going? What is our outcomes that we are seeking? Point number one. Point number two, what are the outcome indicators, the measurements that we are looking to measure our outcome and we are looking to manage toward? Third, what are the strategies that have some evaluation and some evidence base that can help us feel confident that when we put them in place, they're going to get a result? Fourth, we needed to allocate our resources behind this impact agenda. And fifth, we needed to use data to help us not only measure our progress, but help us course correct. Now, when people hear social impact, they think about measurement. You know, my view is measurement is just a part of it. But what is the most important part of it is understanding that we have to lead differently. We have to know what outcomes we want to achieve, know what indicators are so that we can measure our progress toward those goals. So we embarked on this journey first and foremost, I will tell you this, first and foremost to increase social impact. But the reality is that achieving impact and measuring it in times of scarcity and fiscal austerity is going to mean the organizations that can measure impact are the organizations that are going to get the funding. Because when dollars are scarce and a donor wants to make an investment, they're now going to make their investment, and we're seeing it already among foundations, corporations, even in individuals. We're seeing a clear bias toward putting dollars into organizations that are getting and have measurable results. So that's kind of the journey we embarked on now, and it's not easy. And it's really about systemic change and thinking about our roles differently, managing, leading toward achieving very specific outcomes. Now, in the whole process, we learned a lot. And I would say chief among them is that there's no substitute for courageous and focused leadership, because this work isn't easy. And when I say leadership, I mean leadership at all levels, at the board level, at the senior level, all the way through an organization nationally and locally, all committed to a vision, all driving impact, all courageously leading in spite of the challenges that are out there for us. Second thing, we need to learn as a sector to manage toward outcomes, to know where we're going, to be able to measure where we're going, and to course correct to make sure we achieve the outcomes we set out to. Number three, big learning, is that evaluation and evidence-based means a lot in today's world. Not only does it mean more money and a better opportunity for donors to invest in your organization, more important to me, and I think to you, is that those evidence-based strategies, those evaluations that prove effectiveness, they're the ones that are going to help make the biggest change in the lives of our kids. Fourth thing, we learned that the problems we face are way too big to go at this alone. And if you recount and recall what I just talked about, whether it's public housing, Native American land, schools, it's about partnership. It's about the public sector, it's about the private sector, it's about the nonprofit sector coming together to solve problems. And last, I would emphasize that as we go forth in our work as a sector that is now 1.6 million nonprofits, 1.7 trillion in revenues, and 10% of America's workforce, as we go forth with this might, we must remember our distinctive imperative to serve those who need us most and do so with impact. We're at a crossroads now. We can go one way or we can go another. And I'll leave you with one repetitive thought. The power and potential of the nonprofit movement is largely untapped. Untapped. Its potential is enormous, but it has not yet been untapped. So now is the time not to be complacent. Now is the time, our time, to be courageous and to reach and serve those who need us most, and do so in a way that creates social impact greater than anything ever imagined, because the future of America depends on it. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you. I just was wondering, you had mentioned having the right metrics being so important.
I can't hear you.
You had mentioned having the right metrics is so important, and I was wondering if you could discuss what some of the metrics that you are looking at are, both mission and business.
Okay,
metrics.
The importance of metrics, great question. So if you look at high school graduation, for example, what are the metrics that really matter in academic success? So at Johns Hopkins, they have an institute that's looking at the why and the how of high school failure or school dropouts. And basically what they found is that there are 3 indicators that will tell you if a child is going to graduate or not, likely. And those indicators, and the reason why I like these indicators so much is because they're easy to remember. It's A, it's B, and it's C. The kids who tend to do well are going to attend school regularly. The kids who are at risk are not. They're going to be absent a lot. They're not showing up the way they should show up to school, by the way, at a pretty young age. B, the kids who are going to succeed are not going to have serious behavior problems. And behavior problems, by the way, can be outward or inward. They could be the kids who are sleeping in the back of the room. And C is course failure. If they're starting to fail courses in the middle school and prior, then they are at risk of dropping out of school. And so those are the things, those are the metrics that we want to measure. But in addition to that, we're looking at grade level progression so that, particularly middle schools. Remember I used that 63% statistic? So the idea is if we can get kids into the 10th grade, they're going to graduate from high school. If we can get them through 9th grade. And so our focus, 7, 8, 9 on middle school is, really very much a part of our strategy. I hope that answers your question.
Because parents are so much part of the success of children, I know this is a frustration for a lot of organizations who work with children. They go back into environments that are not supportive, and they start kind of losing the momentum that they had. Have you found any techniques that work to engage the parents more in their children's activities, especially academics?
Yeah. Well, parents are a big part of it, and You know, parents in the communities we live in are under a lot of stress. They're mostly single parents, and they have a lot of kids, you know, 3, 4, or 5 kids by a single parent. I mean, I struggled with one. I don't know about the rest of you, but here is a dilemma, because we do invite parents into our clubs, and it's very hard to get them to come to us. And so what we tend to do is feed people. And so, you know, we have dinners at the club, and parents, and that gives us a chance to talk with parents. But I would say, Mark, that a lot of our parents had bad experiences in school. So they're not so eager, you know, to go into that school and to make the kind of relationships that they really should. And, you know, we do encourage them to do that. We go with them. And in some cases, we go, you know, remember parent-teacher nights? A lot of our staff go to the parent-teacher nights and then share. So, you know, it's not an easy thing. But I have seen time and time again kids rise above their home circumstances and go on to do great things. They do need a support system. And when they have one like the Boys and Girls Club, it gives them a leg up. It gives them a leg up. Our kids call the Boys and Girls Club their second home. Some call it their first home. Some call it their only home.
Roxanne, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about programming. I understand that the Boys and Girls Clubs are more than just daycare. So if you could talk a little about programming, what happens when a child goes in there? What can they expect on a day-to-day basis?
How many of you have heard the expression, kids vote with their feet? They do. And so, first and foremost, I make this point that the Boys and Girls Club has to be an inviting atmosphere for them. It has to be fun. So if you go into the club, there's a gym, there's a games room, there's a learning center, there's a technology center. So the club is a place where kids can kind of pursue their interests. There's arts in the club, and there's staff. And the staff are the people who really bond with kids. And if you ask anybody that's a longtime club member what kept them coming back, it was that it was a fun place and they loved the staff who really cared about them. But within the Boys and Girls Club, we do daily homework help and tutoring. We have educational enrichment activities. We identify, using those metrics, kids who are at risk of dropping out of school, and make sure they have a mentor and that somebody is with them, checking in on them and giving them the encouragement they need. We also have, you know, great technology labs. You know, in many ways, the technology lab has become as popular as the gym. And so, you know, kids are learning technology. They're learning, you know, unbelievable kinds of claymation and game technology, and so there's a lot of learning going on in the clubs. There's a lot of physical activity that goes on in the club to address some of the problems we're seeing in young people today in terms of obesity. And there are small group clubs that teach service, civic engagement, and the democratic way. So there's a variety of means. You have to keep the fun in the club, or the kids won't vote with their feet. They won't come back, but you also have to have intentional strategies to get an intentional result.
Thank you. You mentioned the metrics, and you mentioned the fact that that's what you are targeting. What's the results for that? In other words, because of the Boys and Girls Clubs, how do the metrics change as a result of it?
Okay.
Is there some evidence on that?
Yeah, I wish I had the answer for that, but it's so, you know, this is a chapter we just embarked on, so we don't have, you know, a complete set of data. But what we are doing is collecting some data around various issues and comparing them to national benchmarks. So we have a database. So if you ask kids about grade level progression. So how many kids progress from 7th to 8th grade. Our clubs can track that, and we can compare that to a national database. But we're not there yet. We can't make any statements yet. Our alumni survey is very telling in a very directional way. So the alumni survey tracks alumni, and we do it every 3 years or so, and the results are pretty much the same. 67% of the kids say the club, now the adults say, that club, it kept me out of trouble with the law. 28% will say, I would have never graduated from high school if it weren't for the Boys and Girls Club. Now, this is self-report. 57% will say the club actually saved my life. So that's the kind of alumni data we have, which is very different than a disciplined, methodological way of collecting and analyzing data.
I see. Let me ask just one more question also. The Boys and Girls Club, it's not mandatory for these kids to participate, and therefore,
right.
Is there a sense that you might miss out on the very vulnerable? In other words, there may be sort of a selection bias. People who are at the margin may be attracted by it, but those in greatest needs you may still not be catching that pool.
I get asked that question a lot, and I think it's a very good question. I think that our first strategy is to be where the kids need us most. So the federal government has kind of an index, and through that index you can find, it's level 1 through 8 in terms of distressed communities. So what we try and do is locate our clubs in the most distressed communities. Now, many of them are not in those most distressed communities, but the idea is the lion's share is. So they should be able to attract, the kids living in that. Now, do they self-select? Yeah, that's a good possibility. And it could be that we're serving kids, some of them who really are struggling, and others who are surviving, and others who are thriving. We do have outreach workers in many of our clubs, particularly in gang communities, to bring kids who are, seriously at risk into the club. So yeah, that's a possibility. But we want to grab them all. So, and on the data, I'm hoping, this time next year we should be able to make some national statements. It's just a little too premature now. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Roxanne, you talk about very eloquently how the problems that we face are too big to face alone, and the importance of public and private partnerships. Can you cite, I know there are many really wonderful examples within the Boys and Girls Club movement of those kinds of partnerships, public, private, and particularly if you can think of an example that would include the higher education sector as well.
Yeah, I personally think higher education is an untapped resource for Boys and Girls Clubs. And where there are good relationships with the universities, there are student volunteers, there are student interns. Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut is an example. So the president of Trinity College was actually a club alum, and it's in a very distressed area. And his idea was, well, let's lift this neighborhood. It was called the Frog Hollow neighborhood. So they got, federal money, and they put street lights in, and they had this plan to build this education corridor with a school, a Boys and Girls Club, a museum, and they raised a lot of federal money to get that done. So it really lifted the houses out of negative equity overnight. That's what that did. But it was the private, it was a public sector, the government, it was the university, it was the Boys and Girls Club, and to a certain extent it was corporate. Now, I just want to say a word about corporate too, because I think that's a really interesting evolution in how corporations now, as part of their business strategy, are addressing social needs, most often the needs that are compatible and reflective of the business that they're in. Microsoft invested millions in Boys and Girls Club in terms of technology, starting technology programs, providing free operating systems for every one of our clubs. We have companies like Coca-Cola that, companies now are concerned about social issues, not in and of itself, but what needs to be done in the context of their business strategy. And so we're seeing a lot of significant investments that are bundled. So corporations now that work with us and provide big amounts of money, yeah, there's the cash, there's volunteers, there's board members, there's pro bono services, and there's in-kind products, and there's marketing. So I think what we're seeing is that private sector is now an ally. And, I think there's a lot of room to grow there, but it's come certainly a long, long way. So I think we need to be thinking about not just how schools can work with Boys and Girls Clubs and nonprofits, it's schools, it's corporations, it's the, other nonprofits in the community, it's the universities. So together, we can change the trajectory, not just of kids, but social impact is about communities too.
Hey, Roxanne, why don't you mention the architectural speech for the summer?
Oh, yeah. So I get this email. I've been teaching here for a while, and I talked to all of our clubs about the university, and there was one student who was placed in a Boys and Girls Club in Lawrence, Massachusetts, who was from the School of Architecture here, and she graduated, and she was going on to do her PhD or her thesis, and so she emails me out of the blue and says, the project I'm going to undertake is to start a Boys and Girls Club in Chicago. Now, that's a whole complex, kind of thing, but the idea was that, as a university student, she had some exposure to a nonprofit, and now as part of her work going forward, she was passionate about what she experienced, and she wanted to bring that to bear in her professional career, which I think happens a lot. And that's why, your programs like your summer learning programs, summer service programs, are hugely important in inspiring, college students to ultimately go on to do great things, but to always be mindful of the importance of giving back.
Okay. At what rate is the Boys and Girls Club growing? Do you have any long-term goals in terms of the amount of clubs?
Can you talk a little louder? I'm sorry.
Yes. Okay. So at what rate is the Boys and Girls Club growing? And is there any long-term goals? And what percentage of clubs fail?
I didn't hear.
What percentage of clubs fail? And do you want to talk about growth?
Yeah. Well, we were on a major growth trajectory, and we had a wake-up call in 2008. And, when the Great Recession began at the end of 2007, we had a good year in 2007, but probably mid-year in 2008, we saw the closing of quite a few clubs. And we saw that in 2008, we saw it in 2009, and we started turning around in 2010, in 2011. Now we're back to 4,000 clubs. And so when, that illustrates an important point here, and that is the dependence of nonprofits on community support. And it speaks a lot to how, and for us, I think our closures were modest compared to some other organizations, but I think the real lesson here is that our clubs are part of a community, and the extent to which they establish those community ties is a source of strength. So if you look at, our Challengers Club in South Central Los Angeles, many years ago, maybe not so many years ago, there were the LA riots, and I'm sure you all know something about that and have heard about that. And it was a very ugly time in May of, I forget the year, but there was a lot of rioting, looting, fires set, destruction in South Central Los Angeles. And in the end, President Bush, 41, had to do a press conference in South Central LA. The only building that he could find that was unharmed and still intact was the Boys and Girls Club. And that's where he made his address to the nation. So the extent to which, and I think this is a lesson for all nonprofits, that we are embedded in the community and we create good things in the community, that the citizens will come together and keep it thriving. But the forces were so great in that recession that we did lose some clubs.
Hi. You've explained really clearly a great need in this country, and I was wondering if you might be able to give us some examples of other organizations or other programs that the Boys and Girls Club looks up to and learns from that's also addressing this need.
Repeat that for me, I'm sorry.
I was just wondering if you could tell us other organizations, whether in America or elsewhere, that are also doing a great job addressing this need that you've described.
Did you say AmeriCorps?
No, sorry, just any other organization, whether in this country or others, that's also doing a great job that the Boys and Girls Club can learn from.
You know, the Boys and Girls Club model is ubiquitous. And so it's adaptable, it makes sense, and in many ways it embodies the values of this country, which is good people coming together around a good idea to make their communities better places for children. And so, you know, you see clubs starting, and we used to say, you know, we won't operate in buildings we don't own. We used to say we're not going to rural communities, we're an urban organization. And we used to say, by the way, that we won't serve girls. And so, you know, we started as boys clubs. We were boys clubs until 1990. And, you know, what you find over time is that you have to challenge the assumptions. And we did. And if we didn't believe that we could operate in clubs we don't own, we would have never been able to serve as many kids as we do now. And the idea now is in Mexico. There are 8 Boys and Girls Clubs in Mexico. We're chartered by Congress. We can't, to serve kids on U.S. territory and military bases. We can't charter the clubs in Mexico, but we help start them. We're doing the same thing in South Africa, the same thing in Uruguay right now. Yeah.
He was also asking if you would bless any other organization that you think is creative.
Oh, yeah, you know, there are a lot of great organizations out there. If you look at the Harlem Children's Zone, you know, that organization is phenomenal. Big Brothers Big Sisters do a great job. The Harlem Children's Zone is about taking blocks in Harlem and saying, we're not just going to address kids, you know, we're going to address the things that go on around them. So it's a very holistic view and a very intense means of serving kids in a very distressed community, meaning Harlem, which is actually on the mend now. So Harlem Children's Zone is a standout example of that.
Hi. So my question's about kind of development for people like our age. And so a lot of us in this room are undergraduates and graduates in university. And so I was wondering, so from your experiences as a university student, how would you say you developed during that time to kind of lead you along your path to, you know, devote a substantial amount of your life to helping others?
You know, I didn't start out thinking I'm going to run a nonprofit organization. You know, I always wondered why nonprofit had even that label. It was just an anomaly for me. But I got a teaching degree, and I taught in some very distressed communities, in very small communities, upstate New York, one on Indian lands. And I had two, my background was public health administration, so nothing added up in that direction. But I knew two things. I knew, one, that I really cared in a very deep way about kids, and number two, that I didn't necessarily want to spend the rest of my life teaching. So I started looking for other opportunities. I got hired at the time by Boys Clubs of America. That was in 1978, a long time ago, probably before some of you were out of elementary school. And I took a job that was combined public health and kids. And so the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation had funded a project which I was directing, and I filled in for the director who left, to work with the medical community to get kids who didn't have a source of primary health care a source of primary health care. So I signed on to Boys Clubs of America for 8 months. That was 36 years ago. By the way, and I say this to all my students here, I never had the benefit of any education in nonprofits. So my learning was all on my own. But it made me value tremendously the investment that this university made in the M&A program, because it's just helping build leaders for the sector.
Roxanne, before we let you go, let me ask if you would address the dark side of your business, which would be fundraising. I'm wondering if you have deliberate development strategies to identify donors. I'm wondering if you have a staff dedicated to that, and how you go about raising the money you need and then allocating it.
Okay. Yes. The dark side, if you take 2012, it wasn't a dark side, nor was 2011. It was a rocky road, let's put it that way. But, I spend a lot of my time, I retired as CEO at the end of 2011, and I was asked to stay on and launch a campaign for Boys and Girls Clubs of America. And, so that's what I've been doing for the last, it seems like 14 or 16 months. So we launched a campaign. Now, we have some real strengths in fundraising, and we have some real weaknesses in fundraising. So one of our strengths, perhaps our biggest strength, is corporate fundraising. And we do a tremendous amount of corporate fundraising. And we're highly skilled, and we have a whole corporate team that works with, Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies. We have a relatively strong record in foundation fundraising. By the way, one of the keys to the corporate fundraising has to do with the strength of our brand and the fact that we are a multi-local organization. So if you overlaid the communities that are important to most big companies, there's a Boys and Girls Club right in the communities they care about. So foundation fundraising is relatively strong. Government funding, really on the decline, but still significant. And I would say our greatest weakness is in terms of major gift fundraising and building a donor database that we can cultivate for future fundraising efforts, individuals. So in launching this campaign, we started with major gifts. And I'll make a point here, and it's not going to surprise you, Adam, that I'm making this point, but part of our strength is our board. Our board is made up a lot of corporate CEOs and nationally recognized leaders. And so the corporations that are on our board, the corporate leaders, CEOs that are on our board, generally have an affinity, and their company makes an investment in us, and that helps with corporate fundraising. But in terms of individual giving, we have to learn how to better leverage our brand, and through a multi-channel direct marketing effort begin to significantly grow our database to hundreds and thousands of people and begin the process of cultivating and moving them up to become major donors. So that's kind of where we are. We have, the campaign is, $500 million campaign. In the first year, we raised, it's a 6-year campaign. I know it's small by Notre Dame standards, but it's big for us. And in the first year, we raised $100 million. And a third of that came from individuals, but they were our board members. See, they're close to you, they're engaged with you, and the more engaged they are, and the more capacity they have, the bigger the gifts will be. But we have a lot of room to grow on this direct marketing to capture individuals. A lot of room to grow.
Roxanne, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.